Have you ever wondered if our pets understand us more than we think? What if the love and loyalty they show us goes beyond simple companionship? What if they are silently praying for our happiness and safety? In today's story, we're about to take you on an unforgettable journey of love, betrayal, and redemption through the eyes of a dog named Bailey. A dog that went beyond his instinctual bond with his family and became their guardian, even when they didn't deserve it. But what happens when a family's hidden secrets threaten to break this loyal companion? Stick around to discover the powerful message Bailey brings. Trust us, you won't believe what happens next. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you never miss an emotional story like this. If you feel the love, share this video with your friends and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts on Bailey's extraordinary journey. Your support means everything. In a quiet town in Kentucky, 17-year-old Emma Thompson found her closest companion in Bailey, a golden retriever with warm eyes and an even warmer heart. To Emma, Bailey wasn't just a pet. He was her best friend, always by her side, offering comfort and love. But her 19-year-old brother, Jake, saw Bailey differently. Rebellious and short-tempered, Jake viewed the dog as useless, especially since Bailey never barked when Ryan, Emma's kind-hearted boyfriend, sneaked over to visit. While Bailey quietly helped Emma and Ryan share their secret moments, Jake's resentment grew. He couldn't understand the bond between Emma and her dog, or why Bailey seemed more of a friend than a guard. For Emma, Bailey was her protector, but for Jake, he was just a problem waiting to be solved. Neither of them knew that Bailey's loyalty would soon lead to a moment that would change everything. The morning light seeped through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the living room, where Bailey, the golden retriever, lay quietly. Usually he'd be bounding around, wagging his tail and following Emma everywhere she went. But today was different. Bailey remained still, his usually bright eyes watching Emma with an unsettling calmness. "Bailey, are you feeling okay?" Emma asked, crouching down next to him, gently running her hand over his soft fur. Something in his eyes made her feel uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Emma, relax," Jake called out from the kitchen, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's just a dog. Maybe he's tired of you pampering him." Emma sighed, looking up at her older brother. Jake had never understood her connection with Bailey. To him, the dog was nothing more than a distraction. "He's fine, Jake," she replied softly, though her concern for Bailey grew. Jake leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, watching Emma's every move with a mixture of disdain and annoyance. He didn't get it. He didn't get them. To him, Bailey had been nothing but a nuisance, especially when he'd failed to protect Emma during those late-night visits from Ryan, her boyfriend. Jake remembered all too well how Bailey had quietly let Ryan slip in and out of the house, never alerting anyone, never raising a bark. It drove him crazy. Bailey was supposed to be a guard dog, wasn't he? Instead, he seemed to be Emma's loyal companion, helping her sneak around behind their parents' backs. As Emma finished packing for her weekend trip with friends, Bailey remained by her side, still strangely quiet. Normally, he would have been at her feet, eager to help her gather her things. But today he just watched her, his gaze heavy, with something Emma couldn't quite decipher. "You'll be good, won't you, Bailey?" Emma asked, as she knelt down to give him a final scratch behind the ears. She smiled, but the unease lingered. "I'll be back soon." Bailey's tail gave a weak wag, but his eyes seemed distant, as if he knew something she didn't. Jake, standing in the corner, couldn't help but mock the tender moment. "Yeah, sure. Leave your precious dog with me. I'm sure we'll have a blast." His voice was cold, filled with bitterness. Emma, ignoring the sarcasm, gave Bailey one last affectionate pet before grabbing her bags. "Thanks, Jake. I owe you one." As she stepped out the door, Jake's smile faded. He watched Emma leave, then turned his gaze back to Bailey. The dog remained where he was, his eyes still on the door. "Looks like it's just you and me now," Jake muttered under his breath. His voice held a tone of something darker. Resentment, maybe, or anger. "Let's see how much Emma really cares about you when you're not there to be her little protector." Bailey stayed silent, his stare fixed on the door, as though he were waiting for Emma to return, hoping for something more. The house felt empty, too quiet. Jake stood in the living room, staring at the spot where Bailey had lain just moments ago. The golden retriever was nowhere to be seen, and for the first time, Jake felt a pang of guilt. But that feeling quickly faded as frustration bubbled up within him again. Emma was gone for the weekend, and Jake was stuck at home with Bailey, the dog who had ruined his attempts to be the center of attention. Bailey had become too much, too loyal, too loving, too much of a reminder that Emma's heart wasn't his to command. Jake had tried to ignore it, but the irritation had been building for days, and now here they were, just the two of them. Bailey sitting there, looking at him with those sad golden eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. It was like the dog could see everything. The jealousy, the resentment. Jake could feel it tightening in his chest like a knot, and before he even realized what was happening, his hand reached out. In one swift motion, Jake shoved Bailey harshly, pushing the dog away from him. Bailey didn't even resist. He simply backed away a few steps, confusion flickering in his eyes. But then Jake's anger flared again, and in a flash of fury, his foot came down on the dog's side. Bailey let out a soft yelp, but it wasn't loud and it wasn't sharp. Just a quiet plea for mercy. Jake froze, staring at the dog. The realization of what he'd done hit him like a punch to the gut. Bailey staggered but didn't fall, limping away slowly, his body clearly in pain. But the dog didn't whimper, didn't bark in protest. Instead, he just turned and limped toward the door, his movements slow but determined. Bailey wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't going to let Jake see the full extent of his hurt. Jake stood there, watching Bailey, as the dog slowly made his way out of the house. "Go ahead," Jake muttered under his breath. "Walk off if you want. I'm sure you'll come back." But Bailey didn't look back. He simply kept walking, leaving Jake standing in the empty house, a wave of guilt washing over him. Yet he couldn't bring himself to admit what he had done. "It's no big deal," Jake tried to convince himself. "It's just a dog. He'll be fine. He always comes back." But even as those thoughts crossed his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about this felt different, and he hated that he couldn't pinpoint exactly what that was. As the hours passed and night fell, Jake pushed the incident further to the back of his mind. Bailey will come back. He kept repeating it like a mantra. After all, what had happened was nothing compared to the chaos of everyday life. He didn't need to tell anyone. He didn't need to admit what he'd done. Still, the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach wouldn't go away. Something told him that this time, Bailey wasn't going to just come trotting back through the door. Bailey's steps were slow and painful, each one making the ground feel farther away. His body ached, but his determination burned brighter than the pain. His golden coat, usually so vibrant, looked duller as he limped through the empty streets of the small town. His heart was heavy, not just from the physical injury, but from a deep sense of betrayal he couldn't shake. The pain in his side was intense, but he pressed on, driven by an inexplicable urge to go somewhere he hadn't been in a while. He wasn't sure why or how, but all he knew was that he needed to get to the place that had always felt like a sanctuary, a place where peace and calm seemed to flow through the air, a place he had once visited with Emma, back when everything had felt simpler. The Temple of St. Jude, nestled on the outskirts of town, stood quietly in the early morning light. Its simple stone structure and tall, narrow windows were framed by trees, giving the place a serene, almost otherworldly aura. Bailey had been there many times before with Emma, sitting in the cool shade while she prayed, or simply enjoying the calm of the surroundings. But today was different. Bailey wasn't there for peace. He was there because something in his heart told him it was the place he needed to be. The moment he limped through the gates, Bailey knew he had arrived. There was no fanfare, no crowd waiting to greet him, just the quiet serenity of the temple. He made his way through the garden, past the carefully tended flowers, and slowly, painfully, entered the main hall. The scent of incense filled the air, mixing with the soft whispers of prayer and the peaceful rhythm of the bell that chimed every hour. In the corner of the room, sitting quietly by the altar, was Father Michael, the elderly priest who had known Emma since she was a little girl. The gentle man had always treated Bailey with kindness, often offering him a treat or a gentle pat on the head whenever they visited. But today, as Father Michael glanced up, he noticed something different about the dog. Bailey wasn't running around playfully like he had in the past. No. Today, Bailey walked slowly toward the altar and sat down, his body trembling slightly. His large brown eyes, filled with silent sorrow, seemed to gaze at something beyond the altar, something far away. Father Michael felt a tug at his heart. He stood up from his chair and made his way over to Bailey, kneeling down beside him. "Bailey," he whispered gently, "what brings you here today?" The dog didn't respond, only sitting still, staring at the altar with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. The priest, having known the dog well, didn't press the question. Instead, he offered Bailey a bowl of water and a small piece of bread, as he always did when the dog came to visit. But Bailey, despite his obvious thirst and hunger, refused. He didn't even glance at the food. He simply remained there, quiet and still, in his silent vigil. Days passed, and Bailey continued his daily visits. Each morning, like clockwork, he appeared at the temple gates, limping toward the altar, where he would sit motionless, his gaze unwavering. No matter what was offered to him, food, water, treats, he refused. The dog seemed to be there for a purpose no one could understand. The townspeople, curious and confused, began to notice Bailey's strange behavior. Many of them had seen the dog with Emma in the past and knew him as the loving, playful pet of the kind-hearted girl. But now, something was different. Bailey's daily visits were becoming a mystery that no one could explain. Some whispered that the dog was grieving, that something had happened to Emma, but no one could confirm it. Others speculated that Bailey had become attached to the temple after spending so much time there with Emma. But the most persistent rumor came from the children who had seen Bailey walk past their houses each day. They spoke of the dog's eyes, how they were filled with an unspoken sadness and a silent plea. Some of the more observant children claimed that Bailey's gaze never left the altar, as if he was waiting for something or someone to appear. What was it that Bailey was seeking at the temple? That was the question that hung in the air as the dog's daily visits continued. Little did anyone know. The dog was there for a reason far deeper than anyone could have guessed, and the truth would soon unfold in a way that would break the hearts of all who knew him. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the Temple of St. Jude. It was another quiet evening. The soft rustle of leaves outside the temple, mixing with the steady rhythm of Father Michael's prayers. As the elderly priest moved between tasks in the small chapel, he couldn't help but glance toward the altar, where Bailey sat, as he always did, still, solemn and silent. Father Michael had grown accustomed to the dog's presence, but something about it today felt different, more intense than before. Bailey hadn't moved all evening, and his golden fur shimmered under the fading sunlight, though his usual energy and playfulness were nowhere to be found. It was as if the dog were waiting for something, or someone, he could not see. Unable to ignore the pull in his heart any longer, Father Michael walked slowly over to Bailey, kneeling beside the dog. He could feel the weight of the room shift, a quiet stillness settling around them. "Bailey," Father Michael murmured gently, his voice soft and caring. "Why do you come here every day, my dear friend? What is it that you seek?" Bailey didn't answer, of course, but his eyes, the eyes that had always been full of joy and life, now held an unmistakable sadness. They were wide, almost searching, staring up at the altar with an intensity that seemed to pierce the very air. There was a depth in those brown eyes, something Father Michael had never seen before, a longing so pure and aching that it seemed to speak without words. For a moment, the priest just sat there observing the dog. He couldn't explain why, but a strange sense of urgency washed over him. It was as though the dog's silent presence was a message in itself, one that he couldn't quite grasp, yet felt in the core of his being. Father Michael had always believed that animals, especially dogs, carried a unique connection to the divine. But there was something different about Bailey. This wasn't just any dog showing up for comfort or safety. There was a profound, unspoken purpose behind this dog's daily visits, and Father Michael could feel it deep in his soul. As he continued to observe, something even more remarkable began to happen. Bailey's eyes, which had remained dry for so long, suddenly began to glisten. The dog, sitting perfectly still in front of the altar, began to shed tears, slow, heartbreaking tears that rolled down his furry face and dripped onto the cool stone floor. The sight was so unexpected, so gut-wrenching, that Father Michael's breath caught in his throat. The dog's tears were not like any tears he had ever witnessed. They were not the tears of pain or discomfort, though Bailey had certainly been injured. No, these tears seemed to carry a sorrow that was beyond physical suffering. It was a sorrow that came from deep within his heart, a sorrow that spoke of loss, longing, and an unimaginable ache that no human words could express. Father Michael sat there transfixed, watching as the dog wept quietly, his eyes never leaving the altar. The tears seemed endless, as if they were pouring out of him without control, with no end in sight. The priest had witnessed many acts of grief and suffering in his years, but this silent display of raw emotion from an animal was something he could not fully comprehend. The small group of townspeople who had gathered in the temple for evening prayers began to take notice of what was happening. Whispers spread throughout the room as the sight of Bailey's silent crying left them speechless. Some of the children gasped, clutching their parents' hands in shock. The adults, too, were visibly moved, unsure of how to respond to such an intense, heartbreaking sight. "What is happening to him?" one of the elderly women murmured, her voice trembling. Father Michael's mind raced as he watched Bailey's tears fall. His heart ached for the dog, but there was something else in the air, a sense of something larger, something beyond comprehension. It was as if Bailey was carrying a secret, a story that no one could hear, but one that needed to be told. And yet, the dog could not speak, only communicate through his silent vigil, through his unrelenting presence. The priest's thoughts wandered to Emma, the kind-hearted girl who had always brought Bailey to the temple. He wondered if she knew about her dog's silent suffering, if she had any idea why Bailey was here day after day. But no, he realized, she didn't. The mystery was far deeper than anyone could have imagined. As Bailey continued to cry, Father Michael's heart broke. He gently reached out and placed a hand on the dog's head, offering what little comfort he could. "Don't worry, Bailey," the priest whispered softly, his voice full of empathy. "You're not alone. We are here. We will listen when the time is right." But in that moment, as the dog's tears continued to fall, Father Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. The dog had come to the temple for a reason, and it was a reason that would soon be revealed in a way no one could have expected. Bailey's tears were not just tears of sadness. They were the first hints of something far more profound, something that would change everything. And as the priest sat beside the dog, watching him cry, he couldn't help but wonder, what was it that Bailey had come to tell them? Emma returned home from her weekend trip, the familiar scent of her small Kentucky town filling the air as she stepped inside the front door. She had barely unpacked when a wave of panic surged through her. There was no sign of Bailey. She called for him, but the house was eerily silent, the absence of his joyful bark ringing louder than any noise. "Bailey," she called again, walking through the rooms, her heart sinking with each step. She checked his favorite spots, the living room couch, the backyard, the spot near the window where he often lay to watch the world outside. But Bailey was nowhere to be found. Her mind raced, the sense of unease growing with each passing second. Had he gotten out? Was he lost? What had happened to him? Frantic, Isma grabbed her phone and began texting everyone she could think of, neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen Bailey. She called their local vet, even asking if anyone had brought in a golden retriever recently. No one had any answers. Her heart pounded as she tried to calm herself, but it was no use. "Where are you, Bailey?" she whispered to herself, desperately wishing the dog would just show up at the door, like he always did when he wanted attention. But today was different. Jake watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, eyes watching Emma's frantic search. He didn't say a word, only letting out a sigh and pretending to remain unaffected. On the inside, though, he couldn't ignore the growing knot in his stomach. He'd never cared much for Bailey, but seeing Emma like this, it gnawed at him in a way he didn't expect. His actions, his anger, everything that had led to this moment felt like it was hanging over him, a weight he couldn't shake. But he remained silent, as indifferent as ever. Emma refused to give up. After hours of searching, she decided to take one last step. She would go to the temple. The place had always held comfort for her, a sanctuary for both her and Bailey. Emma had taken him there many times, and she prayed that maybe, just maybe, Bailey had wandered there, seeking refuge in the one place she knew he felt safe. The cool evening air greeted her as she walked toward the temple, the soft glow of the lamps outside, casting long shadows. She was so focused on finding her dog that she didn't even notice the peaceful silence of the town, which usually brought her a sense of calm. Tonight, it only added to her worry. As she entered the temple, the familiar scent of incense and the soft murmur of prayers greeted her. But something felt off. The air felt thick, like the quiet was hiding something. Her gaze swept over the pews, but she didn't see Bailey. Emma's heart sank as she approached the altar, praying that her dog hadn't gone far. And then she saw him. There, sitting silently by the altar, was Bailey. But he didn't look like the dog she knew. His usually bright eyes were dim, his golden coat dull, his posture slumped. He looked frail, weaker than Emma had ever seen him. His body seemed smaller, as though the weight of whatever he had been through was pressing down on him. "Bailey," Emma gasped, rushing to his side. She knelt down beside him, tears welling up in her eyes as she gently touched his head. "Oh my God, what happened to you?" Bailey didn't react, only lifting his head slightly to look at her. His eyes, those sad, soulful eyes, seemed to hold a story, but he couldn't speak it. His body was so still, it was almost as though he had given up hope of ever being understood. Father Michael, who had been watching from a distance, approached Emma. He had seen the distress in her face as she entered, and now, seeing the reunion between her and the dog, he knew something had to be done. "I'm so sorry to see him like this," Father Michael said softly. "Bailey's been coming here every day for the past week. He's been sitting just like this, quietly, as though he's waiting for something. He doesn't eat. He doesn't drink. He just stays here. I'm afraid there's something more going on than what we can understand." Emma's eyes widened in shock. "Every day," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Why? Why would he come here alone?" Father Michael shook his head. "I'm not sure, but he's been very persistent. It's almost as though he's searching for something or someone." Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest. What could have happened to Bailey? Why would he come to the temple every day, looking so sad, looking so lost? And why had he stopped coming home, leaving her with this sense of dread and helplessness? She looked down at Bailey, her heart breaking for him. She couldn't understand what had driven him away from their home, but she knew she couldn't leave him like this. "I'll stay with him," she whispered, brushing a few strands of hair behind her ear. "I won't leave you, Bailey. I promise." Father Michael gave her a kind but concerned look. "He needs more than just your presence, Emma. He needs answers, and I believe there's a story here that goes beyond what we can see." Emma nodded, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. What had happened to Bailey? And what had driven him to seek refuge in the temple, day after day? She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. She wasn't leaving until she understood. Emma gently tried to coax Bailey to leave the temple, but the dog wouldn't budge. His usual exuberance had been replaced with a quiet, almost sorrowful determination. Bailey lay still by the altar, his golden fur resting against the cold stone floor, as if the temple had become his sanctuary, a place where his troubled heart could seek solace. "Bailey," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "It's okay, boy. Come home, please." But the dog didn't respond. His eyes, though tired and heavy, remained fixed on the altar. There was something in those eyes, something that told Emma that Bailey wasn't just sitting there out of tiredness or confusion. He was waiting for something deeper than she could understand. Father Michael observed the interaction with a deep sense of empathy. He could see the bond between Emma and Bailey, but he also sensed that there was something more at play, something beyond the physical injuries Bailey had suffered, beyond the pain Emma could see. He could feel the heaviness in the air, the unspoken grief that seemed to radiate from the dog. "I'm sorry, Emma," Father Michael said softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "It seems that Bailey has chosen this place. He's found something here, something he needs, more than he needs to be at home." Emma blinked back, the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She glanced down at Bailey, her heart aching. She could feel the pull in her chest to take him back, to bring him home where he belonged. But she also understood that she couldn't force him. She couldn't ignore the quiet determination that had taken over him. He wants to stay here, doesn't he?" Emma whispered, more to herself than to Father Michael. The priest nodded gently. "It seems so. Perhaps he feels he's found peace here, a place where he's not judged, a place where his pain can be understood, even if no one can speak it. Emma took a deep breath, swallowing the lump in her throat. She could feel the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. Bailey had always been more than a dog to her. He was a protector, a friend, a constant companion. The thought of leaving him here, in this quiet temple, filled her with an overwhelming sadness. But as she gazed down at him again, his eyes meeting hers, with a calmness that seemed almost peaceful, she knew what she had to do. "All right, Bailey," she whispered. "I'll let you stay. I'll come back, I promise. Just take care of yourself." Father Michael nodded in approval, his eyes filled with understanding. "I'll make sure he's looked after. Don't worry, Emma. He's safe here." With a heavy heart, Emma reluctantly stood up and wiped the tears from her cheeks. She cast one last glance at Bailey before walking toward the temple's exit, leaving her beloved dog behind, in the place he seemed to need most. As she walked back to her car, the weight of the decision hung heavily on her. She couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. Bailey had always been so attached to her, so full of life. Now he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere she couldn't follow. Back at home, Jake sat in his room, staring at the floor. His usual indifference was gone, replaced by something much heavier, guilt. He couldn't escape the thoughts that tormented him, the images of Bailey's sad, pleading eyes. The dog hadn't deserved what he had done. Bailey had always been so loyal, so gentle, and Jake had hurt him in his frustration, not thinking about the consequences. He had seen Emma's distress, heard the panic in her voice as she searched for Bailey, and he knew that his actions were the cause of it all. He'd wanted the dog gone, wanted to prove a point about his uselessness, but now it felt as if he'd broken something precious. He had always dismissed Bailey as just a dog, but now the weight of his guilt was crashing down on him, overwhelming him in a way he couldn't escape. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with images of Bailey, the way the dog had quietly limped away, the way he had sat at the temple, silent and heartbroken. Jake couldn't shake the thought that Bailey had been calling out for something, someone, to notice him, and no one had. As the hours dragged on, Jake's guilt festered. It gnawed at him, clawing at his insides. He had no idea how to make things right, no idea how to undo the damage he had caused. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Bailey was gone, and Emma was devastated, and he was the reason for it. That night, Jake had nightmares. The same images of Bailey, sitting alone, eyes wide with pain, his body broken, haunted him in his sleep. He woke up in cold sweats, gasping for breath, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a stone. He knew he couldn't go on like this, pretending nothing had happened. He had to face it. He had to make things right. But the question lingered. How could he possibly fix what he had done? The evening air had grown cool, a soft breeze sweeping through the open doors of the temple as Father Michael knelt beside Bailey. The dog sat perfectly still, as he had every day since Emma had left him there, his eyes fixed ahead, unblinking and focused. The priest, deeply attuned to the presence around him, felt a strange, otherworldly stillness in the room, something more than just the silence of a faithful dog. Father Michael gently placed his hand on Bailey's golden fur, his fingers tracing the dog's spine with reverence. Bailey, normally so responsive to human touch, didn't stir. He remained motionless, his eyes reflecting something deeper, a longing that transcended the physical world. "What are you seeking, my friend?" Father Michael whispered, his voice soft and filled with compassion. Bailey didn't respond in any way that a human would recognize, but as Father Michael sat there, quietly meditating, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. but a gentle awareness, like the subtle pulling of a thread that led him deeper into understanding. In a moment of mystical clarity, something beyond the ordinary realm of thought washed over the priest. Bailey's deep sadness, the way he sat day after day by the altar, the way his eyes seemed so filled with purpose. Father Michael could feel it now. Bailey wasn't here for himself. He wasn't praying for comfort or solace. He wasn't seeking healing for his own wounds. No. The truth that blossomed in Father Michael's heart was something far more profound. The dog, in his silent, unassuming way, was praying for Emma. Father Michael felt the weight of that revelation settle heavily in his chest. The dog's every action, his quiet vigilance, his refusal to accept food or water, all pointed to one clear truth. Bailey's purpose was not for himself, but for Emma. For her happiness, for her protection, especially in the struggles she faced with Ryan. Bailey's quiet, tireless devotion was a prayer in itself, a prayer that Emma would find peace, love, and safety. It was as if Bailey understood the challenges Emma was facing, the emotional turbulence she felt. Father Michael's heart ached for the girl he had seen grow up in this town. Kind, loving, but burdened with unspoken worries. It seemed that Bailey, in his innocent way, had become her silent guardian, her protector not just in body, but in spirit. But as Father Michael continued to kneel there, his hand still resting on Bailey's back, a new, more troubling thought began to form in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that something terrible had happened to Bailey at home, something that had driven him to the temple, something so deep and painful that it could only be expressed in the form of a silent prayer. The idea gnawed at the priest, and his mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of what he had observed. Bailey's behavior, the sadness that seemed to hang over him, the way he had refused to return home, even when Emma had begged him. All of it seemed to point to something darker. Father Michael began to wonder if Bailey was not just physically injured, but emotionally scarred by something that had taken place within the confines of the home he had once shared with Emma. The dog's sorrow was more than just the result of a simple accident or injury. It felt deeper, as if Bailey had been a silent witness to a deeper pain that had affected him far beyond the physical. Father Michael looked at Bailey again, the dog's eyes still fixed ahead, unblinking. The priest could almost hear the quiet, invisible prayer, the prayer of a dog who had seen too much and was trying to shield the one he loved from the pain that lingered. In that moment, Father Michael understood. Bailey's loyalty, his unwavering silence, his refusal to leave the altar, it was all for Emma. Bailey was holding on to something far greater than himself, and he wasn't going to let go until he felt she would be safe. The revelation struck Father Michael like a bolt of lightning. Bailey wasn't just a dog. He was an instrument of divine care, a protector who had been sent to help Emma through a dark and difficult time. But what had happened to bring such a sorrow upon the dog? The priest couldn't yet answer that question, but he knew one thing for sure. Bailey's presence at the temple was no accident. There was a deeper connection, a spiritual bond that Emma might never fully understand, but one that Father Michael was beginning to grasp. The priest stood up, his heart heavy with this newfound understanding. He couldn't yet speak of his thoughts, but he knew he needed to act. He needed to uncover the truth of what had happened to Bailey. And most of all, he needed to protect both the dog and Emma from whatever shadow loomed over them. With one last look at Bailey, Father Michael whispered softly, as if to the divine forces that surrounded them, "You are not alone, my friend. I will find out what happened, and I will help you both." Bailey's ears twitched slightly, but he remained still. It was as if he understood, as if the dog's silent prayer had been heard. And Father Michael, for the first time, felt that he was on the brink of understanding something much larger than either he or Bailey had ever imagined. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jake's usual rebellious attitude had shifted to something deeper, more burdened. She noticed his fidgeting, his inability to meet her gaze, and the guilt that seemed to hang in the air whenever Bailey's name came up. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Finally, after days of silent tension, Emma couldn't hold it in any longer. She sat down in front of Jake, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Jake," she said softly, "what's going on with you? You've been acting so strange lately. What's happening?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The weight of his guilt seemed to crush him, but he didn't know how to confess. He had been running from the truth for so long, convincing himself that what he did didn't matter. But as Emma's eyes bore into him, he knew he couldn't keep lying. I did something to Bailey," Jake finally confessed, his voice trembling. "I hurt him. I didn't mean to, but I did. I was frustrated, and he just wouldn't leave me alone. I thought I could make him go away." Emma's heart shattered at the words. She had suspected something was wrong, but hearing Jake admit, it felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to process what he had done to the dog she loved so much. I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt him. I don't know what happened. I've been so angry. I was jealous, I guess. I hated how much you loved him. I felt like I was invisible next to Bailey, like I didn't matter." Emma's grief mixed with anger, but she kept her voice steady as she spoke. "Jake, how could you do that to him? He's never done anything to hurt you. He only ever loved us, especially you, even when you didn't deserve it. He was a friend to you, and you betrayed him." Jake's eyes filled with tears as he hung his head in shame. He had never felt more regret in his life. He had let his jealousy cloud his judgment, and now he was faced with the terrible consequences of his actions. Emma's anger gave way to sadness, but she knew what had to be done. "I'm taking Bailey back. He deserves so much more than this. He deserves the love and care he's given us, without asking for anything in return." With that, Emma stood up, her heart heavy but resolute. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't leave Bailey at the temple any longer. She walked out the door with a newfound sense of purpose. Bailey would come home, and Jake would have to face the consequences of his actions. The road home was quiet. Bailey, though weak and frail, was with them, nestled in Emma's arms as she carried him inside. His once vibrant energy was gone, replaced by a somber stillness that weighed heavily on Emma's heart. She could feel the strain of his injuries, the toll of everything he had silently endured. But she promised him she would make it right. Emma and Ryan took turns caring for Bailey, tending to his wounds, making sure he had everything he needed. It wasn't easy, but they were determined. Bailey had always been there for them, silently watching over them, and now it was their turn to care for him. As the days passed, Bailey's strength slowly returned, though it would take time for him to fully heal. One evening, as the soft glow of the setting sun filled the room, Emma and Ryan sat beside Bailey, the dog resting contentedly at their feet. Father Michael had come to bless their future together, offering a prayer for their lives ahead. Bailey, despite his weariness, watched quietly from the floor as Father Michael spoke the words of the blessing. Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek as she realized something profound. Bailey had been praying for her happiness all along. It was in his silence, his unspoken devotion, that she had found the strength to heal, to forgive, and to move forward. His wish for her had never been for his own comfort or safety. It had always been for her. Bailey recovered slowly but surely. The physical wounds had healed, but the deeper scars, those of betrayal and loss, would take longer to fade. Yet over time, Bailey became more than just a dog to Emma and Ryan. He became a symbol of loyalty, love, and forgiveness, a reminder of the unspoken bond that transcends words. Jake, too, began to change. His guilt over what he had done to Bailey weighed on him heavily, but he didn't let it break him. Instead, he used it as a catalyst for growth. He became an advocate for animal welfare, dedicating his time to helping protect animals and teaching others the value of kindness. Through his mistakes, Jake had learned a valuable lesson, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Months later, Emma and Ryan stood together in the living room of their home, hand in hand. Ryan looked down at her with a smile that reached his eyes, and Emma knew without a doubt that everything they had been through had brought them closer. They were ready to take the next step together. With a soft whisper of love, Ryan proposed to her, and she said yes. Bailey, though aging, remained the heart of their family. His golden fur was graying, and his steps were slower, but his eyes still held that same deep, unwavering loyalty. He had been through so much, and yet he continued to be the protector of Emma and Ryan's love, the silent guardian of their future. The story ended one evening with Bailey resting peacefully by the window, looking out at the family he had prayed so hard to protect. His body might have been tired, but his spirit, his love, was eternal. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. She looked at Ryan, then back at Bailey, and smiled. Love speaks in many forms, sometimes through silent prayers from those who love us most. And with that, the story of Bailey, the guardian dog, came full circle. His love had saved them all. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey with Bailey, the dog whose loyalty and love transcended words. His story is a powerful reminder of the deep bond we share with our pets and how their love can guide us through the most challenging times. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others who need to hear it. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspiring stories like this one. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned and remember, sometimes the most powerful prayers come from the quietest hearts. Until next time, take care and cherish those who love you.